Welcome to this panel of Reimagining Architectural Pedagogies, Bridging Academia Practice and Planetary Urgency. I am Mridu, and on a day-to-day basis, I dabble between running a practice and running an educational institute, and I'm deeply honored by sharing this stage with some of the most prolific names that have done this for a while. We have two luminaries, Professor Chhaya, an architect, educator, a thinker, tinkerer, whose methods and writings have really shaped Indian urban narratives, from heritage restorations to sustainable civic spaces. We also have Miss Ingrid, who we've spent a lot of time with the past 1 week. A reformative educator, a practitioner whose global perspective, international studios and collaborations. She champions innovative pedagogies that respond to our warming world. Welcome, both of you. Today, as we talk about architecture in this moment of planetary crisis, and I know sustainability is a really, it's a very overused word in our field, but I think in context of education, I would like to take this opportunity to discuss this further. But before we jump into that, I'm very curious because of the previous panel, why do architects design so many chairs?
I think we now know that Western architects design chairs. But I think it's a really interesting question because this is so in tune with the conversations we had yet last night, but also with the discussion today. I think there are assumptions about what it gains credibility in terms of design, and this goes back to the conversation that we were just privileged to listen to, that there is an assumption that somehow what we loosely call the global south, which is as problematic a term as sustainability, is somehow becoming prominent or learning a design language. It always had a design language, and it isn't perhaps necessary to always contextualize or to talk about it for it to gain its prominence. So I think that maybe the chair is because we don't actually understand that there is a more diverse way of sitting.
Interesting, sir. Would you comment?
Yeah, I suppose all of us Indian architects, in order to consider ourselves architects as defined by the world, started sitting in chairs. Though at home, for example, when I sit down to dinner, I sit on the ground. And much of what my activities and my family's activities are on the ground. And we only sit on chairs for more formal purposes. So, but to be accepted as an architect, you have to make things. And chairs are cheaper to make than buildings. And so till you get to design buildings, you may as well make chairs.
Yes, that is so cute and interesting, sir. But this brings me to a very critical conversation. I know I'm sitting in also an educator's chair, but institutions like the ones you are associated with, the AA, CEPT University, have really given us generational talents. But most prolific architects of the past, because now education is formalized, like Le Corbusier, Tadawando, Louis Barragan, Didi Contractor, have largely had self-directed paths through apprenticeships and travel. So is education really necessary for architects if you had no rules? And what should the learning environment of today, keeping in mind our futures, provide for such education?
Okay. I think, obviously this is debatable. I can list a lot of really great architects. I mean, Geoffrey Bawa, Manette de Silva, Ram Koolhaas, Zaha Hadid, etc., who were very well educated at the AA. Anyway, but, I can go on to some that maybe were educated elsewhere. But, But I think that this is a really interesting question. So, you know, when I talk about the school, we talk about our Pritzker Prize winners and the Riva Gold medalists, etc. But we forget, and I think if there's any practitioners in the room, that architecture is generally not produced by a single individual. And I think a good education teaches you to work collectively. I think a good contemporary education teaches you that an equal participation with others is what makes good work. It's a short answer.
Yes, nice.
Yeah, I suppose those who spend money, they need to have some assurance that whoever is given the work will be able to do it. And a degree is often a sort of standard. Though once you start getting known, for example, people who did not have a degree, for example, just 2 days ago, I came across somebody at the IIT Gandhinagar who guides PhDs. So I thought, wow, this man must have, and I found out that he doesn't even have a bachelor's degree. But IIT Gandhinagar accepted him. And I think it's quite okay whether some can be educated and qualified, the others show their work and then become acceptable. And I think that's quite okay.
Right. Do you think, what is the nature of a learning environment that an institution provides? Of course, like you said, it gives you colleagues, competitors, or even, you know, people who you come together as a tribe. But what else do you think education gives more, a little bit more? I would like to urge you to think a little bit more, because I'm very curious about this myself, being in this field.
Goodness, I mean, I've enjoyed almost a week of conversation with you and with Saurabh about this very topic. And I think we've questioned everything from what education is to what architecture is. Goodness, I mean, what didn't we question? And so perhaps I'm more confused on this topic than I was when I came to you in the first place. But I think, you know, what I've recognized over the years is that the educational environment is a place where mistakes can be made many, many times, and bravery can be built. And not an insensitive bravery, but something that enables people to go into the world, to ask questions of each other, not to feel that they are alone in that world, but to take those risks in a way that is informed and that is perhaps the fear of those mistakes has been mediated by a lot of experience. And that perhaps isn't enough to do with education, but it certainly is the most positive outcome of, I suppose, the repeated exposure of your ideas to others.
Well, a school or a place of learning is a community. It has, of course, a kind of curriculum. It has rooms in which you sit and so on and so forth. But more than anything else, it's a community. And in the community, there are very interesting things that happen. There are, for example, if I look at Indian classical music, they say, ये राग हमारे घराने में ऐसा गाया जाता है, दूसरों का पता नहीं है, लेकिन हमारे घराने में ऐसा गाया जाता है. So that gharana, the community which carries the lore of learning, has a certain shape, and accordingly it is distinct. But there are also chaps who say, come on, that man is now completely finished, old-timer. In the school you will find, come on, that teacher. And so in a school you've got pushes and pulls of various kinds. And the curriculum is only a kind of framework against which you can pit your senses. But more important than that is the social life of the educational institution. And I think it's a wonderful place for gossip mongers like me. And so it's a place where you share many things, including an attitude towards life.
I completely agree, of course. Education gives us a sense of belonging and also gives agency, I think, to students to be in an environment where you feel with good examples, if you role model things, there is a path to get there, and that's very hopeful, I think. Otherwise, it's very lonely.
But you forgot the other part, which is that it's also a place that you can protest against, or you can take out hawa nikal di uski, huh?
Right,
that
right.
kind of thing.
But this is really difficult. I mean, I told, my students got together at some point a few months ago, and they were very worked up about something. I can't remember what it was. And I said, why are you complaining? You know, you're the generation that needs to start the revolution. You know, this is your time. And they said, well, you know, with all of, you know, core studies submissions, how are we going to start the revolution? I was like, if you're worried about this, there's no revolution coming. But I think this is very true. I think the pushing, the socialization, the idea that news travels fast, that maybe it's not just the role models, it's the ability to navigate good and bad that you learn through that community.
Yeah, and I also give this example many times when students come, it's like entering a gym. You have the trainers, you have the machines, but that doesn't guarantee fitness. That will happen only with your own motivation, and that's a metaphor we use. I know it's a little simplistic, but it reminds me that the degree will happen very much because of what you want to get out of the institution. So this leads me to the second question, that in our globalized world, we're constantly pushing for what are our shared values and so on, whereas in individual places, it screams for specificity of context. So should education be standardized universally, or what type of contextual learning should it have? Should a school in India be the same as a school in London? What are your thoughts? Because you do have schools that are very global in nature.
I think it's a kind of pipe dream to think that you could standardize anything, including.
It's a nightmare, no?
It's a nightmare. But then she's saying maybe we should. Yeah. So industrialized. Actually, for example, in reaching the AA, I possibly have to take a bus or a tube or a bicycle to reach the class in AA. But if I want to reach the design village, I will have to walk through those people selling things in the middle of the road. And my experience of the day of education will be completely different from her education day experience. And I think however hard the world tries, you cannot make it uniform. And that's the fantastic part about the world, that you will never be able to standardize education. I mean, that what a Babu wants to do is always to write a curriculum and say, this is the curriculum, this is the national curriculum, and this is the international curriculum. UIA will come out with these things, Council of Architecture will come out with these things. And you say, yes. So when Council of Architecture people come, we tweak our drawings in a way that they think, oh yes, you have fulfilled the requirement. And I think that is important, that you don't try to, if you are looking for a national presence or an international presence, you show your school, oh yes, we are very international. And if you are showing a Delhi presence, show your Delhi things. It doesn't matter, actually. What is happening is the process of learning is about questioning about disagreeing, about being afraid of making mistakes, but yet making mistakes. And I think you are absolutely right when you said this is the place where you make mistakes again and again. And I think this is what it is, no standardization.
Also, Ingrid, you have learners from almost every part of the world, very less from the UK. And that's a very diverse bunch, so I'm wondering, how do you impart learning there?
Oh, it's very easy. No, I mean, no, of course. But no, I mean, I think what's interesting is, you know, the AA at the moment has 81 different nationalities represented. We've graduated, I think, 131. I'm trying to work out which countries I'm missing. But I think pretty much everyone is a fish out of water. And everyone is generally in a new place, trying to find a place to live, trying to find the place to buy affordable food. And it creates a kind of collective and set up a kind of mutual support system, which I find really extraordinary. Also out of that are very many very brave ways of thinking. And that across nationalities, across genders, etc., people are very willing to tell you what they think and how they're managing. But I mean, we recently had our RIBA revalidation, and it was interesting.
Yes.
And of course, you know, certain members of my team got very worried about it. And I keep saying to them, there are things that we do, and they're like hygiene. You know, it's sort of, you brush your teeth, that's fine. We all assume you brush your teeth. We don't design a curriculum around brushing your teeth. Having said that, there are some very difficult moments. I think that the architecture world in the UK woke up to its responsibility with the fire at Grenfell. Which is not just an architectural responsibility, it's an entire political and cultural responsibility. But a lot of that lies with the architect, in that we are responsible for the world in which people live, and we need to do that in a careful way. Now, the question is whether you achieve that through regulation and uniformity, or you achieve that through a mature conversation about the nature of responsibility and the kinds of things that you embrace, not because you have to, but because you should. So I think that when it comes to contextualization, I think that can, I think what was interesting in the last conversation is that context felt like something you had to explain. Mm-hmm. Like you had to give a history when you present a building or an object or a design. And I think actually there are the contexts, as you say, of the individual and individual experience. There's the context of the ability to create work. There's the context of the difficult or more pleasurable conversations that you have around that work that create a responsible architect. I mean, I would say definitely not the regulation.
Right. So this also brings me to the question of values, because like you just mentioned that you speak to students and explain it to them in a particular way. But I'm also wondering that, do you think values like ethics, ecology, equity can be imbibed in the curriculum, because it does have some value there, so that people don't forget. And if people change, things don't go completely haywire. So are there any things that you do particularly in your institutions or in your experience that has led to this moral compass coming alive, especially for architectural education?
I don't think you can legislate for, it's hard to legislate for ethics. You know, you should be ethical. And I'm going to make sure I can find a set of questions that I can say yes or no to demonstrate your ethics. I remember interviewing people in a role up in Cambridge, and a lot of questions were around EDI or DEI or whatever, whichever order you want to put the initials. And all of the good candidates said, you know, it's not what you say, it's what you do. And actually good diversity and inclusion happens because whoever's at the top demonstrates that, and then the rest of the staff demonstrate that. It's the same thing for ethics. If you treat people with respect and you teach in an ethical manner, you teach ethics through the way in which you behave. And for me, that's a conversation I have with the staff, not directly, but I'm sure you have the same situation where you question the briefs that they're setting, the questions that they're asking, and through that, you have them call attention to, I suppose, again, that level of responsibility. But I just don't think you can curricularize it as such.
Yeah, I think, in my experience, much of this is indirect. I mean, For example, in Nairobi, where I used to teach, we had the first 2 weeks of a student's life was to stay in a slum in Mathare Valley, which was the main slum of Nairobi. And the student got used to the idea that you have to go with a bucket and bring water, you have to do this, you have to do that, and so on, and then started looking at their own lives somewhat differently. In Ahmedabad, the same thing was being done by what was called the related study program. And the first year would go to a village somewhere. There was no place to stay in the village, so you went during the time of the local school's vacation, and the teachers and the students all stayed in that place. There was only one bathroom, and we all lived there for a week. And through that, you got to know, listen, there are people in India who live with this. This is their normal life. And it brought about a kind of feeling that I'm not designing only for those who can afford a whole lot of things, but I'm really part of a society in which I have to be concerned for everyone. And this kind of thing, I think, is really important. That the architecture school is really a kind of place where you go through number of experiences that people of all levels of your society have. And I think that's very important.
It just reminds me, my favorite book of Richard Sennett's is The Uses of Disorder.
Yes, that's right.
And so he sort of equates the desire for privacy as a kind of psychological immaturity. And that to be truly mature, you have to understand interdependence.
Yes.
And I think this is very much what you're saying.
Yeah. If you live in a one-room house, then you know how to find your space and how to let others find their space and so on. And I think this is very important, that the student, from wherever he comes or she comes, is able to feel that a happy life does not require this or that, but it really requires consideration. And that, I think, is very important. That is ethics.
I think this is so beautiful because this is also something we do at the village. It's like a mode of experiential learning, where if you experience something, you automatically learn to imbibe it. And we call it villaging. And I think I can see it everywhere. And most of the students here in the audience, if they are here, they would know this. But this also brings me to design leadership. And a question which I think nowadays has been asked in a lot of architecture forums is that we've really idealized the star architects. And the star architect is a person who has got critical acclaim, fame, and usually is invited by very big real estate developers also to get very flamboyant, iconic work out there. And somewhere we feel that with the planetary urgency, I think it's the time of the service architect, who is the most responsible one. And how do you think we can prioritize service over spectacle? And do you think it's still, I mean, in both of your contexts, do you think it is still relevant, this argument?
Okay, I think there are two different questions in there, because I think although some architects reach incredible prominence, doesn't mean they're irresponsible architects.
Of course.
So I think there's actually some very interesting work being done by some very, very significant big names. On the flip side of this is that, I hate to say this, sounds really inappropriate, but the AA is now in a process of becoming a kind of memorial hall of all the famous architects, because they're at the end of their lives. The really big names, I'm doing a memorial for Nick Grimshaw in a few months, Leon Krier. We just, they're still half alive, but we just did a big event for Archigram. I think, you're talking about most of these big names are in their 80s and 90s. And I remember having a conversation with someone at the ETH, They're saying, you know, they can't generate these big professorial chairs any longer out of the big names. They don't seem to exist anymore, which is important and interesting because being a state institution, the ETH has a regulated retirement age. So, you know, Jacques Herzog and Pierre Dumeron, to a certain extent, I think now Peter Merkley is coming up for this. You know, all the kind of the big names have no longer a place at the ETH. And the ones that are coming up are young, often collective practices that are working in alternative ways, are working with material, they're working with the land. These are the new people so it's coming actually organically out of a different set of priorities. You know, a lot of these architects came to prominence at a very particular moment in political and economic history. So, you know, the latter part of the 20th century was a boom period before the recession. These are, you know, you don't have nations, or most nations are no longer commissioning massive cultural projects or big institutional buildings. You know, that era is declining. There are still parts of the world where this happens, and there is a small handful of architects who are then responsible for working in these particular contexts, where I would say an environmental sensitivity is not a priority for their client. The question of being a service architect or being a star architect also, then we forget that we are servicing a client. It's very rare that an architect is fully in charge of their brief. I think that this is also may change. I think there's a particularly interesting conversation around what the value of the architect really is, either in terms of instilling an understanding of an environmental concern, a social concern, but even a financial concern. While architects are very badly paid, we are essentially employed to raise the asset value of property. And we shouldn't forget that. It's a slightly dirty secret we pretend to ignore. But I think if we can combine that power of essentially asset creation with more responsible interests, then there is a future. But I think it's changing naturally.
Yeah, I think one of the things, once you become a star architect, is that you are expected to do a certain kind of work. And the star architect, poor guy, or mostly guys, is in trouble because he can't come out with new ways. Then you don't know whether you'll continue to be a star architect or not. So if you want it badly, you'll do that kind of work irrespective. Now, she's perfectly right that we have now a whole generation of people who are not interested in that, you know, big name or coming in the magazines all the time, and they are doing some very, very interesting work, which takes me back to something else, that in our societies we have got people who make very good architecture. Like, I remember Hermann Hertzberger, we invited him to give a talk at Ahmedabad. And he came to the city and he was just looking like this. And then next morning he went for a walk and he came back and Hertzberger of all people, telling me, wow, you got a city with a fantastic plastic sense. What was he looking at? The Ahmedabad housing society comes up out of the cooperatives movement. So the houses are standardized design, which is built tuck, 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 tuck. Then every family extends, builds something more, does something on top. Here they'll put a staircase, they'll come out, they'll give that thing on rent. And then you see, and you look at any work in India, any city, amazing form. And I think that there is something that we can learn from non-architects, not just non-star architects, but non-architects. And that's something which is worth really starting to document, starting to put across to our students as something really important.
I think the part that you don't design, which designs itself, is as interesting as designing the experience itself. I also wanted to ask you this one question, that nowadays, like you said, we should not forget clients. Architects have to lobby, have to persuade, have to convince, have to really make a case for projects. It's in India as well, of course, a little bit extra. I don't want to, I can see it firsthand. So do you think that the architect of today is a politician? Because a politician does a lot of this.
Hasn't he always been so? I mean, every architect has had to convince the people who are going to pay, and it's a whole lot of money which he could never afford or she could never afford. And so you'll have to be, oh, come, you know, it's really going to be nice, and and then the architect person, I mean, you want to make that thing, you've spent so much time thinking about it, and you think it'll really be a wonderful work, and you have to convince that man to pay for it. And I think that's...
I mean, you're sort of describing a con man, I think, but no.
Yeah. But we are
Yes.
con men in a
But
way.
also diplomats and conflict negotiators, no?
Yes. I mean, we can use good words for that.
I think a conflict negotiator
Yeah,
is probably the
conflict
best.
negotiator, yes. Yeah.
We are going to negotiate world peace. Architects
course.
are the best people.
Of course.
Of
No,
course.
but I also find
But
this...
then you got Netanyahu, who is also an architect, and they are also the best killers of people, because architects can do that very, very carefully. And I think architects are dangerous people in that sense. So the ethical sense is about what is the purpose of what you're doing. And that is something that is continuously in the background of any learning process.
Right. No, I also feel that we are very underrepresented in parliament. Rarely do you find an architect become...
I don't think you want
Pilu
to be.
Modi.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
that is where my question was
I don't
leading
think
to,
you
that
want to
while
be.
we are politicians,
Yeah.
do you think we can play a role in mainstream leadership?
If leadership was really straightforward, yes. But I think I sit on a committee to do with housing that is supposed to be advising government. The conversation moves in circles.
It's everywhere the same thing.
Incredibly frustrating. I think that, and then we had an interesting set of meetings where they're not called special advisors, expert advisors now to the ministers. They said, government's really hard. Like, yes, it should be hard. But I think that there's a sense of distrust at the moment in mainstream politics. There's a sense of apathy. So I do think that the way in which you affect policy probably has to be ground up. And I think that particularly large-scale governments like your own, to a certain extent like the UK, can no longer understand the complexity of everyday need in a way that can affect change that is quick enough. So I think that there are small ways that one can make shifts to policy, but sitting at the top doesn't seem to be making a difference. And there's a kind of incapacitation at that level that I don't think we have a role in. But
Yeah. No, I was talking about Pilu Modi. The Council of Architecture Act, the Architects Act, was passed by Pilu Modi, who was an architect, a good architect in Bombay. And one very funny incident I remember. I hope you don't mind me telling all kinds of stories like this. Indira Gandhi had shouted out from the dais that all these people are CIA agents. So Pilu Modi got badges made. I am a CIA agent, this large. And he came to every school of architecture and distributed. And so we all walked around Ahmedabad with these big badges saying, I am a CIA agent. And I think through humor, the architect was able to do something. And this was very interesting, that it wasn't simply the expression of power, but it was a question about ethics, which which an architect can raise very, very genuinely. And I think the other thing is that in times of disaster, suddenly architects become very valuable to the government. I'm talking about, for example, in 2000, there was a major earthquake in Kutch, and 20,000 people died. And in Ahmedabad, so many buildings fell. And the government asked us to do a damage assessment exercise. And I was in charge of that. Because of this exercise, they suddenly started listening to us. And we said, look, you got to do this, you got to do this. And so many things happened because of that. Same thing when a flood occurs, same thing when some other disaster occurs. And I think these are all opportunities in which we go in with a sense of service, because we won't get a lot of money for that, but we'll go in with a sense of service, but in return, society will give us respect. And I think this is very important.
Architecture as a form of advocacy.
Yes.
Or agency, yes, totally. Professor Chhaya, you mentioned in your keynote earlier this year that this is the century of biology in architecture. I was really hoping you could elaborate a little for our audience.
Yeah. We used to talk about architecture only in terms of physics. This is the load, and to make building which stands as a stable building, you'll have to do it like this. But now, in the last few years, suddenly we have started realizing that water or waste, what happens to waste in the whole total system? How do you regenerate? So it became something which was interested in complex interrelated processes. And there, biology teaches us that all, like for example, if I take our bodies, we have got 100,000 animals living inside our bodies. And it's still a fairly reasonable body, yeah? And architecture, I think, also, if it starts seeing this as, because this is the century of biology, it's no longer the century of physics. If we are going to see complex systems of interaction, of continual interaction, as the basis of human well-being amongst the well-being of creatures, and amongst the well-being of non-creatural existence as well, then we are going to have a different kind of architecture. And I think it's really important that, I mean, look at it. If you look at climate change, if you look at the floods in England right now, terrible things. You never could think that in England you'll get streets flooded with water. It only happens in India, you know. I mean, why? In UK, it's, of all places, it's happening. And it's happening in Canada, and it's happening in everywhere. So now we really have to look back at all the things that the world is doing in the world as a Gaia, which is also a kind of biological analogy. So it is the century of biology.
Ingrid, do you agree?
Oh, absolutely. I'm sure you know Mark Wigley and Beatrice Colomina's books on back. I mean, they would say it's all about bacteria, but but I think it's fascinating because the way they frame that is that we've been fighting against this. So not only do we have to recognize the importance of a kind of biological understanding, but we have to stop fighting it.
Yes.
And I think so much of architecture is fighting it. It's more concrete. It's more.
Right.
It's more creating a rigid system.
Yes.
And the flexibility and the resilience of biological thinking is absolutely essential.
And I think now we need to go beyond human, because when we are doing riverfront projects now, the river is the biggest stakeholder and not the human beings. And we really need to shift our mentality to that.
I come from a city where we forgot that.
I know, sir, I don't want to rub it in. In the last 50 years, the education of architecture has evolved, changed. So how do you think the graduates of 1975 and 2025-26 are similar or different? It's something that I've wondered, and I would love to hear what you have to reflect on this.
Well, I am a graduate of 1975. So I suppose I can't say much more than that. But I also know a whole lot of graduates of 2025. And really speaking, even though I like to say that, oh, today's generation is like this and today's generation is like that, and virtually we are having the same problems, same worries. They are also looking for somebody to fall in love with, and they're not finding. Or they had a fight with the one that they fell in love with. They are also
looking at... Do they
looking
find them in
at...
architecture school? Do they find them in a school of architecture?
Oh, that's the main place.
Love.
Yeah. Why do you go to architecture school? I mean, come on, you should have known that long time ago. I mean, sometimes it's a planner, not an architect, but it's okay. But it doesn't matter. I mean, that's the least of the things. But there are other aspects in which the anxieties of joining the world in which everybody seems to know their place and us not knowing our place, that is the most important adventure that you are beginning in 2025. You began the same way in 1975. I really don't think there's that much of a difference.
I mean, I meet a lot of people. In fact, I had a really beautiful message from someone who was a graduate from the A in 1949. Wow. And he had his graduation address by Clement Attlee, who was the then Prime Minister, long ago days. I hate to put this out there. There's a lot more women, which is important. And I think one somewhat negative aspect of this is that the world is an expensive and difficult place in a way. It always has been. But I look at our students and I keep on having people who came maybe not 1975, but slightly earlier. So an incredible presentation from Mike Davies and Alan Stanton, who Mike Davies became the partner of Richard Rogers when they founded the partnership, and Alan Stanton became Stanton Williams. But they'd gone out to Los Angeles in 1968, and they made inflatables. Apparently Mike Davies invented the inflatable man that you see outside of American car showrooms, etc. And they played with materials that they found in the skips outside the aircraft industry, etc. And they had this tremendous freedom, and they could just try anything, and they could play. And I think that the opportunities for play are a little bit more limited. So I think as educators, we have to enable play as much as we can.
Absolutely.
I completely agree, because like Professor Chhaya also mentioned, students at that age are coming to also have fun, also live a life. I mean, like we all did. And both of these people, yesterday, I asked them, would you like me to ask a particular question? And they said, yeah, but we don't know how you will ask it politely. So this is my polite self. Why do architects talk so much?
Well, I've been talking quite a lot, so I'll leave it to you first.
I think the problem with this question, I realize now, is that it's really difficult to talk to without just embarrassing yourself. I think sometimes it's to make excuses. I think that it's also a little bit an insecurity. I mean, can you imagine, for those who get to build in the world, you create something that people resist, embrace, misuse. It becomes part of the world, and you don't have anything to do with it. No one calls you up or asks you to stand outside the door and say, well, my first idea was to really understand the context of the topography and the inherent kind of social background of the community that informed. You're not there. The building stands on its own. But I think we don't trust it to. we think that perhaps it's that we haven't done enough, or that somehow it can't speak for us, or that somehow in the construction process we've missed something.
I think there's something that happened towards the end of the last session, where Ingrid pointed out, and I thought quite rightly, both of them were talking, because you were asking about ethics or anything. I mean, you could ask, what is the direction that design will take? What is this? What will happen to this? Etc., etc. And architects compulsively have to give reasons for everything. And that is something that comes with the jury system. That is something with the sense of extreme responsibility that we all have as architects. So, to me, some of the older ones are very interesting. Like Doshi always used to say, "Khabar nathi, mane khabar nathi." So it would be, "I don't know." And to him, that statement was an escape valve for anything. You ask him something, and he'll say, "I don't know. Huh? Maybe, what do you think?" And you say, "But I asked you that question." He wouldn't speak. I think we architects, see how I'm speaking so much just to justify not speaking? There it is.
No, but I think it's because the architects are the thinkers of today's world, and the future, I hope we don't stop talking. I feel that our voice, our fraternity's voice, is important, and yeah, I would like to end it by saying thank you to both of you.